Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 171, IO 533c. Ever since Io declared that he is good at talking about Homer, but is uninterested in any other poet and has nothing to say about them, and as it were nods off, since then Socrates has been offering counter-examples and asking Io if it is the case that, for example, someone with the techne of painting would be able to talk about one particular painter but not about any other painter, and would nod off if anybody else talks about other painters. And then in sculpture, someone with the techne of sculpture would not just talk about one sculptor, but would be able to talk about all sculptors. The idea is that if you have a techne, then you must be good at the whole subject of that techne. Then Socrates adds a few more examples. Someone with the techne of flute playing would be able to talk well not just about one flute player, but all flute players. Someone with the techne of kithara playing would be able to talk about any kithara player, not just one. And anyone with the techne of singing, being accompanied by the kithara, would be able to talk about any singer being accompanied by kithara, and not just one singer in particular. And Io agrees to all of these cases, that in all of these cases someone with the techne of the actual subject would be someone who would be able to talk well about any technites in that subject, any craftsman, any artist. Finally, Socrates comes to the example of the techne of rhapsody, and he says, wouldn't it be ridiculous if there was someone with the techne of rhapsody who would be unable to talk about Io? Io is the great representative of rhapsody, just like the other great names Socrates has already used, like Orpheus as the example of someone with the techne of singing accompanied by the kithara. As I mentioned last time, what's strange about this is that rhapsody itself allows a rhapsodist to talk about someone with the techne of poetry. For example, Io talks about Homer. Homer is the one with the techne of poetry, and by analogy with all of the examples Socrates has given, it is someone with the techne of poetry who can talk about someone with the techne of poetry, just as someone with the techne of singing accompanied by the kithara is the one who can talk about Orpheus, who is a singer accompanied by a kithara. So if Io has the same techne that Homer has, why is it that he doesn't make poems? He can declaim, he can recite from actual poets, in his case mainly Homer, but Socrates has now made the talking about the subject the actual techne, because now someone with the techne of rhapsody is someone who can talk about Io, not about Homer. For the sake of clarity, I called the techne of poetry, the techne of sculpture, the techne of flute playing, all of these technai, I called them first-order technai, and anyone who practices these technai would be first-order technitai, craftsmen. For example, Homer would be a first-order technites. or Orpheus would be a first-order technetes. A second-order technetes would be someone who talks about these people. Someone who talks about Homer would be a second-order technetes. Someone who talks about Orpheus would be a second-order technetes. According to this, then, Io would be a second-order technetes if he is understood to have the techne of Homer himself, the techne of poetry. But then, someone who talks about Io with that same techne would be a third-order technetes. So Homer is first order, Io second order. Someone who talks about Io would be third order. But Socrates has made a techne about rhapsody. Someone with the techne of rhapsody would be able to talk about Io. It's as if rhapsody is now a techne with a technetes like Io. Io actually performs the techne, so he's a first-order technetes, and someone with that techne talking about Io would be a second-order technetes. This may sound complicated, but actually Socrates has clarified the problem. Is Io someone with the techne of poetry, like Homer, or is he someone with the techne of rhapsody? Are the two technai different? If so, how are they different? Now, this problem has been raised, but Socrates hasn't raised it explicitly. They're discussing yet another problem, which is that Io can talk only about Homer. He has no interest in any other poet, and this is not something that he has really been exploring with his questioning. Io has gone along with the questions and has said that in any other techne, people who can talk about one technetes can talk about all technetai, which is itself debatable. The apparent argument is that someone with techne knows everything about that techne, including all technetai, all the craftsmen of that techne, and therefore any craftsman can talk about any other craftsman in the same craft. When Socrates comes to his final example, first of all, he doesn't say, is it possible for someone to be able to talk about Io but not talk about other rhapsodes? He begins by saying, is it possible that there is someone who doesn't know anything about Io at all? In every way, the Io example differs from all the other examples. This is the first time that the person talking about the technetai in a particular techne doesn't know at all what to say about the most famous technetes of that techne. This is the first time that we have a techne which is not first order. To be like the other examples of technai here, the techne which Io has would have to be the techne of the poets themselves, so that he could talk at least about the most famous poet, Homer. Unlike the other examples, as we've just said, the person who is supposed to talk about Io doesn't even know what to say about Io, let alone any other rhapsode. And he would apparently have third-order techne, if he also has the techne of poetry, but he isn't able to say whether Io rhapsodizes or not. In other words, it is hinted here that the techne of Io is not poetry, but rhapsody. In other words, the techne of poetry is to do with making poetry, And then there is the techne of the rhapsodes, which is to recite that poetry. After all this questioning, Io seems to be convinced even more than before that he has a special case, that he cannot talk about other poets while he can talk about Homer. This is his reaction. Uk echo soi peritutu antilegeno Socrates, alekeno emauto sunoida, hoti peri Homeru calist anthropon lego kai euporo, kai hoi alloi pantes mephasin eulegen, perideton allon kai toi hora tuto tiestin. I am unable to contradict you about this, Socrates, but I am conscious of that. I, of all people, speak most well about Homer and have no trouble with finding things to say. Euporo is the opposite of aporo. He doesn't have aporia. And all other people claim that I speak well, but about the others I don't. And indeed, see this, what it is. Io says that he can't contradict Socrates, but he could have lied and said that actually now he thinks about it, he can speak well about all poets, and therefore he must have the techne of rhapsody. Although according to the present conversation, it appears that Io doesn't have the techne of rhapsody or even the techne of poetry, he goes back to his original boast that he speaks the best of all people about Homer, and he has lots to say, and even all other people claim that Io speaks well, but about other poets he doesn't. Interestingly, Io adduces all other people to support his own claim that he is the best speaker when it comes to Homer. Actually, he's the best to talk about Homer, not necessarily here the best at reciting Homer. Those are two slightly different things. You can recite well, but that doesn't mean you can interpret well. He can do both. We know that from earlier. But now, having used all other people as a support for his claim, he now uses them to say that he doesn't speak well about the other poets. It's as if he's using them to show that he is an exception to the rule that Socrates has uncovered with all of his examples from other technai.